All right, and welcome back, Matt Leck. Joining me, as always, David Griscom is here, and joining me, I'm pleased to welcome Lance of the Serfs. I guess that's how I know you, is Lance of the Serfs. I want to say, like, I've known of the Serfs for a while. I saw shares before this, but they came really to my attention during the debacle where YouTube removed your YouTube page. And ever since then, what was that?
It was April Fool's 2 years ago. And
yeah.
Y'all saved us, by the way. The Majority Report was one of the big things that really propelled that story into the mainstream that helped get our channel back. So thank you enough.
I think Left YouTube really came together on that. And ever since then, I've noticed the channel grow and grow. And as not only is it one of the most engaging shows, I think, in this field, but also you guys do some of the most thoughtful stuff, which is not entirely incentivized, I think, in this field. So I just appreciate you for that. And everybody who is not a subscriber should go check out the Serfs Times on YouTube, right? And then there's the Serfs TV on Twitch and Twitter.
Easiest way to find us is just weareserfs.com, has a link to everything there. So weareserfs.com, because we have a lot of little mini channels now. We have Serfs at the Cinema, where I make fun of really shitty movies, typically Christian films, and have a little laugh. So.
Oh, that's great. So yeah, I want to let's start this off. Kamloops 215, that's a combination of words that people have seen maybe scroll past a ticker if you're not familiar with the indigenous community. I would recommend you go look at a lot of the interviews that have been done with survivors of these schools and the sort of dark rumors coming to be realized about the schools that they had to live with. And so, but for people who they've just seen the number 215 and these residential school grave sites, give us the context that we need to understand this and what actually happened at this school and residential schools across Canada.
Yeah, so don't feel bad if you didn't know about any of this, because a recent poll just came out showing that 2/3 of Canadians didn't even know about this, which is kind of disgusting, because it should be a part of our public education system. It is not. I was not taught it in the public education system in Canada. I was taught it because my mother happens to be Métis, and she was always trying to instill a little bit of Indigenous history in me and my brother's lives. But yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, the residential school system in Canada started thanks in large part to our founding Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, and put a footnote on that because I'm going to rip into him a little bit later in this broadcast. And the idea behind the residential school system was that there was obviously a large Indigenous population in Canada, and they wanted to, quote, remove the Indian from within. So the idea was that they would take children from their families, and they would do it literally. They would steal children from their mother's arms and their dad's arms, and then forcibly put them into these institutions called residential schools. There was 139 residential schools across the entirety of the country, and each one of these was originally run by the Catholic Church and eventually was taken over by the Government of Canada themselves and then run by the Government of Canada, and they were horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. Like there's no easy way to sugarcoat what the residential school system was like. It was systematic torture of children. They would remove their language, so they would have to unlearn any Indigenous language they already knew, and then they would have to learn either French or English as a replacement. They would lose their names, whatever Indigenous names they already had. They were given proper Catholic names. They would lose their history, their culture, everything, and then they would have to learn basically Canadian and Western indoctrination as a result. That's just on the surface level. That's kind of the nice things. I mean, nice in quotation marks. What was actually happening on top of that was huge amounts of rape. Thousands and thousands of children were raped by Catholic priests and nuns. Huge amounts of torture. The most horrifying residential school in Canada actually had an electric chair where they were electrocuting children. Yeah, and what happened recently was a satellite imagery photo showed at this residential school in Kamloops, which has been closed since like the 1970s, I believe, showed that there was children buried underneath it, 215 kids to be exact. So that's where this whole thing kind of blew out of proportion and suddenly became world news, because it was the first time a lot of people had heard about this. To the families of those kids, the parents were told that their children ran away. That was more often than not the story that was told to all these Indigenous families, that their kids just ran away, when in reality, they were either tortured, murdered, or let die for a variety of reasons, and they were burying children underneath the schools in mass graves. like straight Nazi shit. You know, like it, and it's like it's this dark, untold part of Canadian history that was happening again at a governmental level. This was done by the government of Canada. It was overseen. The Act, which is called the Indian Act, which I know the term Indian is obviously antiquated, but the Indian Act of Canada still remains to this day. Obviously, it's been updated a handful of times, but it's still very much a real part of Canadian history.
That's the thing about the nature of the schools, like you talked about, and maybe we can get into this too about the boarding schools in America, but like the violence of just the cultural violence of, and I believe the phrase common I've heard is "kill the Indian, save the man," right? Like that's the philosophy behind these schools. So even like the people who weren't murdered and then their families told they were ran away, you are undergoing this incredible violence. I think I don't know if you have any comment on that part. And is there, I guess we will also, maybe we're skipping a little bit ahead, but like we have this history of boarding schools in America, and a lot of the American Indian movement folks in the 70s had scars similar from those schools. Do we know, like, is that, I mean, we obviously know the cultural impact, and maybe we just don't know. I'm not familiar with like maybe the murder history of the American side that we're uncovering about the Canadian side, but I was just curious if you have any info on that.
I can explain a little bit with the reservation system in the U.S. What effectively happens is people think of indigenous people as a monolith, obviously, right? Like, and always have. The reality of it was that there was thousands of different indigenous cultures, as well as, like, in Canada they're called bands, in the US they're called tribes, but each one of them had their own dialect, their own language, their own history, their own culture, their own beliefs. And what the reservation system did in the US is they would squish them all together and place them in these small little concentrated impoverished areas. And then surprise, surprise, years of abuse, neglect would result in things like high levels of alcoholism, high levels of drug abuse, all that kind of stuff. Very similar to the system in Canada with the reservation system here. And the problem when you were talking about the culture and how it affected all these indigenous children is that in indigenous cultures, there is no written language. There's no books. There's nothing. It's all an oral history. So every single generation would pass one culture's lessons, history, all that stuff to the next through what were called storytellers. Storytellers would be the person within the band who would be tasked with the job of, again, learning all the previous history, language, culture, passing on to the next one. So with the reservation system in Canada, effectively destroyed so much of that. When they removed things like the language and the culture from the kids, they also lost their history. And what little is left and preserved is still a fraction of what once was, and we'll never ever know any of that, right? Because it's lost to time now as part of the cultural genocide that occurred.
Yeah, one of the artifacts of that I've noticed in researching, especially North Dakota area Native tribes, is a lot of those documents you can find about those culture were made by the U.S. Army for reasons not to preserve it, basically.
I'm sorry. I just, like, when it comes to the language question, it's just such a terrible, project that has unfortunately just really, really deep roots in, like, English colonialism all around the world, even on the islands itself, from the Welsh children who weren't allowed to speak Welsh as well. Obviously not the same kind of context of colonization and genocide there, but it's such a deep rooted and they've created a system. They had a system that was just so deeply rooted and had been, like, perfected over time to just eradicate, cultures. And what we're talking about right now about losing the history, there's a line that I remember from Russell Means talking about an elder member of their community about what it was like to lose their language, and is saying it's like they've taken the taste out of my mouth.
That's really sad. All of this is really sad, by the way.
I know. I'm sorry. I've been trying to prepare myself for
about these topics, and they're always sad. Yeah, I know. And when they bring me on, they're always like, "Hey, by the way, like, Lance, you're the silly guy, right? Like, you do comedy." I'm like, "Well, yeah, but we're going to talk about some of the most horrifying events in human history for about an hour." Like, I don't know how I could make the Holocaust funny,
Well, yeah, I mean, you start off the video the most or what is the title I want to on the Serfs Times. I want to plug it. Maybe I'll put it in the horrifying treatment of indigenous Canadians on the Serfs Times, with just like, we need to be not afraid to call this genocide, right?
Yeah.
Like we had this, we had that clip of the Israeli settler that everyone was sharing about saying, if it wasn't me, it'd be somebody else. And and like that's shocking to everybody. But to the extent you're descended from settlers in this continent, you have a similar dynamic that you have to own historically. I feel like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree. And like one of the most unfortunate parts about trying to talk about this is trying to do justice. Like we had a huge problem in Canada where conservatives, and they're still doing it to this day, have refused to use the term genocide, right? They've been like, well, I mean, it's horrifying. We're not going to deny that, obviously. I mean, this is a really bad thing, but to call it a genocide, I mean, that's kind of an aggressive terminology, right? The shitty thing, and I don't think people realize, and I have to emphasize this point, is that it's ongoing. This is the thing, and like we can bring up land back a little bit in the land back movement later.
Absolutely.
I have some thoughts on that as well. But in Canada, for example, in 2008, it was revealed that there's a class action lawsuit being put forward by a lot of Indigenous women because under the public healthcare system of Canada, they have been forcibly sterilized. Many times when they were seeking medical attention or medical help, it would be done in response to, by the way, you should probably have like a hysterectomy, or you should probably have something else that prevents you from having children, because we don't want the undue burden anymore of having to deal with all these Indigenous problems and Indigenous kids, stuff like that. That is happening right now. A couple of weeks ago, right at the same time the Kamloops story broke about the 215 kids, it was revealed in British Columbia that young girls, and I'm talking girls, we're talking ages 10 to 13, were forcibly getting IUDs inserted into them. Again, under the provincial healthcare program. So this is eugenics. And again, this is happening right now. Like this is not a sordid history of our past. This is not like, this is active right now. So that's what people really have to realize when you use the term genocide. It's not heavy-handed. It's not heavy, like it's not front-loaded. It's accurate. It is describing what is happening right now.
Yeah, there'd be less sensitivity to it probably if it wasn't active. Really, I looked at the 150 years since the Dakota War, where the Minnesota settlers expelled the Sioux, and that was just, you look at the way that the Sioux were confined, or the Dakota were confined on the Minnesota River. Like those maps look a lot like shrinking Palestinian territory, and ultimately you see violence lash out, and then it's, oh, look at this, look at this violence. Now we need to exterminate these people. Basically, is the logic of it, and yeah, I think that was well put.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if we're talking about Sioux, by the way, I should plug Lost Sioux, spelled LOS, like lost, like the word Sioux, spelled like SIOUX. Twitch.tv/Lost Sioux, an Indigenous content creator who's very unknown. But if you want to help support Indigenous content creators, go check out Lost Sioux on Twitch. She's a streamer who does really good work.